It's April 17, 1975. The streets of Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital, are filled with celebration. After 5 years of brutal civil war, the fighting has finally ended. People wave white flags, welcoming the black-clad soldiers marching into the city. They believe peace has arrived. They have no idea they're witnessing the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Within hours, these same celebrating civilians will be forced from their homes at gunpoint. Within 4 years, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population will be dead. This is the story of the Khmer Rouge, a regime so extreme, so twisted in its ideology, that it literally tried to reset civilization to year zero, and in doing so, orchestrated its own nation's destruction. The question that haunts historians to this day is simple yet terrifying. How does a country kill itself? How does a revolutionary movement promising liberation end up murdering its own people on an industrial scale? And perhaps most disturbingly, how did the world let it happen? Today, we're diving deep into one of the 20th century's most shocking genocides, a story of utopian dreams that became dystopian nightmares, where intellectuals were executed for wearing glasses, and where speaking a foreign language could get you and your entire family killed. Before we understand the horror, we need to understand Cambodia before the darkness fell. In the 1950s and 60s, Cambodia was known as the Pearl of Asia. Under King Norodom Sihanouk, the country enjoyed relative peace and prosperity. Phnom Penh was a cosmopolitan city with French-inspired cafes, Buddhist temples, and a thriving art scene. Students studied abroad, doctors practiced modern medicine, and Cambodia seemed poised for a bright future. But beneath this surface, tensions were building that would tear the nation apart. The Vietnam War was raging next door, and Cambodia couldn't stay isolated. Despite Sihanouk's attempts at neutrality, the country became a battleground for Cold War politics. The United States began secretly bombing Cambodia in 1969, targeting North Vietnamese supply routes. These bombing campaigns were devastating, killing tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians and displacing hundreds of thousands more. The countryside was in chaos, and rural Cambodians, watching their villages destroyed by American bombs, became increasingly radicalized. This is where our story's villains found their recruiting ground. The Khmer Rouge, which translates to Red Cambodians, was a communist guerrilla movement that had been growing in the Cambodian jungle since the 1960s. Its leader was a man who would become synonymous with evil, Pol Pot. Born Salath Sar to a relatively prosperous farming family, he had studied radio electronics in Paris in the 1940s, where he fell in love with communist ideology. But Pol Pot's communism wasn't the Soviet variety or even Mao's Chinese version. It was something far more extreme, a bizarre fusion of Marxist theory, radical agrarianism, and paranoid nationalism that would create a system unprecedented in its cruelty. When Pol Pot returned to Cambodia, he joined the communist movement and slowly rose through its ranks. He was described as soft-spoken, even charming, with a smile that never reached his eyes. People who knew him said he seemed ordinary, unremarkable even, but behind that gentle facade was a mind that would architect genocide. Throughout the early 1970s, as Cambodia descended into civil war between the US-backed government and the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot and his inner circle refined their vision for Cambodia's future. It was a vision that would require erasing everything that came before. The Khmer Rouge promised peasants land and freedom from oppression. They exploited the legitimate grievances of rural Cambodians who had suffered from government corruption, inequality, and American bombing. As the Civil War intensified, their ranks swelled. By 1975, they had 70,000 soldiers surrounding Phnom Penh. The government forces, exhausted and demoralized, collapsed. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into the capital victorious. The nightmare was about to begin. Within hours of taking the city, the Khmer Rouge commanders made an announcement that shocked everyone. Phnom Penh must be evacuated immediately. They claimed American planes were about to bomb the city. It was a lie. The real reason was far more sinister. The Khmer Rouge wanted to empty all cities and towns, to force the entire urban population into the countryside to become agricultural laborers. They wanted to eliminate urban culture entirely and transform Cambodia into a nation of peasant farmers, returning the country to an imagined agrarian paradise. This was year zero, a complete reset of civilization. The evacuation was brutal. Soldiers went door to door, forcing people out at gunpoint. No exceptions were made. Hospital patients were ordered to leave, many still in their beds being pushed into the streets by relatives. Doctors and nurses were told that if patients couldn't walk, they would be left behind to die. Families were given minutes to grab whatever they could carry. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, newborn babies, all were forced onto the roads. An estimated 2 to 3 million people were driven from Phnom Penh and other cities in a matter of days. The highways became rivers of human misery. People collapsed from exhaustion and heat. Those who couldn't keep up were shot. Bodies lined the roads. Within a week, Cambodia's cities were ghost towns. The evacuated populations were sent to rural labor camps the Khmer Rouge called cooperatives, but which were in reality concentration camps. Here, the regime's demented ideology was put into practice. Pol Pot believed that Cambodia's problems stemmed from foreign influences, intellectuals, and city life. His solution was to eliminate all of these things. Money was abolished. Markets were closed. Religion was banned. Schools were shut down. Hospitals stopped functioning. Families were separated, with children often taken from parents to be indoctrinated. Private property was forbidden. Even personal relationships had to be approved by the Angkar, the organization, the faceless authority that governed every aspect of life. Everyone was forced to work in the rice fields from sunrise to sunset, often for 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Food rations were deliberately kept minimal, a thin rice soup that might contain a few grains if you were lucky. Starvation was systematic. The Khmer Rouge believed that people didn't need much food, that human beings could survive on very little. They were proving this theory on an entire population, and millions were dying as a result. People ate anything they could find: insects, tree bark, grass, lizards. Children developed swollen bellies from malnutrition. The weak died first, then the strong slowly wasted away. The daily existence under the Khmer Rouge was a carefully orchestrated nightmare of control and deprivation. People were woken before dawn by loudspeakers, blaring revolutionary songs and propaganda. They would work until dark with perhaps one short break for their meager ration. At night, they were forced to attend political education sessions where they had to confess their thoughts and criticize themselves and others for ideological failings. These sessions could last for hours, with people interrogated about their backgrounds, their thoughts, their loyalties. One wrong word, one suspicious answer could lead to being taken away in the night, never to be seen again. Privacy ceased to exist. People slept in communal barracks where even whispered conversations could be overheard by informants. The Khmer Rouge had created a culture of paranoia where everyone spied on everyone else. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Spouses informed on each other. Friendship became dangerous because a friend today could be your accuser tomorrow. The regime understood that to control people completely, you had to destroy their ability to trust one another, to isolate each individual in a prison of fear. Even the most basic human needs were controlled as tools of oppression. Couples needed permission from the Angkar to marry, and these marriages were often arranged en masse, with dozens of couples married simultaneously in ceremonies that stripped away all joy and personal choice. If you refused, you could be accused of being against the revolution. Pregnancy was monitored and controlled. In some cases, women suspected of having become pregnant without permission were forced to have abortions. Sexual relationships outside of sanctioned marriages were punishable by death. The regime sought to control not just labor and thought, but reproduction itself. the most fundamental aspect of human existence. But starvation was only part of the horror. The Khmer Rouge divided people into categories. New people were those from the cities, considered corrupted by capitalism and foreign ideas. They were given the hardest labor and smallest rations. Base people were rural peasants who had lived under Khmer Rouge control before 1975. They were considered more ideologically pure, but were still subjected to brutal control. The regime was particularly paranoid about intellectuals and the educated class. Teachers, doctors, engineers, lawyers, anyone with education was a target. Even wearing glasses could mark you as an intellectual and therefore an enemy. Speaking a foreign language, having soft hands that suggested you hadn't done manual labor, or being unable to properly grow rice could all be death sentences. The killing was systematic. The Khmer Rouge established over 150 execution centers across Cambodia. The most infamous was S21, or Chuol Sleng, a former high school in Phnom Penh that was converted into a torture and interrogation center. Of the estimated 20,000 people who entered S21, only 7 survived. Prisoners were photographed, tortured until they confessed to being CIA agents or Vietnamese spies, confessions that were always false, and then taken to the Choeung Ek killing fields where they were executed. To save bullets, victims were beaten to death with farm tools, axes, bamboo sticks, or the sharp edges of palm fronds. The executioners would play loud revolutionary music to drown out the screams. The Khmer Rouge had a chilling saying, "To keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss." Entire families were killed because the regime followed the principle of eliminating all the roots and all the grass. If one person was accused of being an enemy, their spouse, children, parents, and extended family were also killed to prevent revenge. Bobbies were torn from their mother's arms and smashed against trees. Children were killed in front of their parents. The cruelty was systematic, ideological, and utterly dehumanizing. What makes the Khmer Rouge particularly disturbing is the youth of its soldiers. Many of the most brutal executioners were children and teenagers, often taken from their families at young ages and indoctrinated to believe that compassion was weakness, that the old world had to be completely destroyed, that killing was revolutionary duty. These child soldiers were taught to obey without question, to show no mercy, to view even their own families as potential enemies if they showed any sign of disloyalty to the Angkar. The regime had weaponized childhood itself, turning innocents into instruments of genocide. The paranoia of the regime knew no bounds. Pol Pot became convinced that enemies were everywhere, even within his own ranks. The Khmer Rouge began purging itself, with former comrades accusing each other of treason. Regional commanders were arrested, tortured, and killed. Even some of Pol Pot's closest allies were not safe. The revolution was eating its own children. This internal paranoia meant that even loyal Khmer Rouge cadres lived in constant fear, knowing that any perceived mistake could lead to accusation, torture, and death. The Khmer Rouge's agricultural policies were as delusional as they were deadly. Pol Pot believed Cambodia could be self-sufficient and could even export rice if people just worked hard enough. He set impossible quotas, demanding 3 tons of rice per hectare when 1 ton was realistic. When these quotas weren't met, it was blamed on sabotage, leading to more executions. Meanwhile, the irrigation systems the regime built using slave labor were often poorly designed and actually made agriculture less productive. But admitting failure was impossible in the ideology of the Khmer Rouge, so they simply forced people to work harder on less food, accelerating the death toll. Communication with the outside world was cut off almost entirely. Foreigners who remained in Cambodia were either killed or forced to leave. Embassies were closed. The regime presented a facade to the world, claiming Cambodia was prospering, while millions were dying behind closed borders. Some Western intellectuals, blinded by their own ideological sympathies, actually praised the Khmer Rouge as brave revolutionaries. They had no idea of the industrial-scale murder taking place. Even when refugees began escaping across the Thai border with horrifying stories, many in the international community dismissed them as propaganda. The world was willfully blind. The international community's failure regarding Cambodia represents one of the most shameful chapters in modern diplomatic history. While the genocide was happening, most nations remained silent. The United States, still reeling from its defeat in Vietnam and dealing with the aftermath of its secret bombing campaign in Cambodia, chose to look away. China, the Khmer Rouge's main patron, provided weapons, training, and political support throughout the regime's existence. Chinese advisors were present in Cambodia, helping to plan and implement the very policies that were killing millions. The Soviet Union, focused on its rivalry with China, showed little concern. Western European nations, concerned primarily with trade and stability, chose not to make waves. Even more disturbing were the handful of journalists and observers who were given carefully staged tour of Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge years. They were shown model villages where healthy, smiling people worked happily in the fields. They saw staged performances of contentment. Some of these visitors returned home praising the Khmer Rouge's experiment in creating a new society. They wrote articles and gave lectures about Cambodia's bright future under revolutionary rule. Meanwhile, just miles from these Potemkin villages, people were being worked to death and executed en masse. The Khmer Rouge understood propaganda, and they used Western naivety and ideological sympathy as a shield behind which genocide could proceed unchallenged. The regime might have continued indefinitely if not for its own aggressive expansionism. The Khmer Rouge began launching raids across the border into Vietnam, killing Vietnamese civilians in border villages. This was partly ideological, as Pol Pot's regime harbored deep hostility toward Vietnam, but it was also strategic, an attempt to rally nationalist sentiment. Vietnam, after fighting decades of war, was not going to tolerate this aggression. On December 25, 1978, Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge army, despite its reputation for brutality, proved no match for the experienced Vietnamese military. Within 2 weeks, Vietnamese forces had captured Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge fled to the jungles, and the regime that had ruled for 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days was toppled. As Vietnamese forces and journalists entered Cambodia, the world finally saw the truth. Phnom Penh was a ghost city, littered with abandoned belongings, documents, and the detritus of a civilization destroyed. Chuol Sleng was discovered with its torture equipment and walls of prisoner photographs intact, a haunting gallery of the dead. The killing fields were uncovered, mass graves containing hundreds of thousands of bodies. The survivors who emerged from the labor camps were skeletal, traumatized beyond comprehension. They told stories of horror that shocked even hardened war journalists. The magnitude of what had happened began to dawn on the world. The death toll estimates vary, but most historians agree that between 1.7 and 2.5 million Cambodians died under the Khmer Rouge regime, out of a population of around 8 million. That's approximately 21% to 25% of the entire population killed in less than 4 years. To put that in perspective, imagine if the United States lost 70 to 80 million people in 4 years. The scale is almost incomprehensible. People died from execution, starvation, disease, overwork, and medical neglect. Entire families were wiped out. The educated class was decimated. Cambodia lost nearly all of its doctors, teachers, engineers, and professionals. The social fabric of the nation was shredded beyond recognition. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. Despite being overthrown, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge leadership escaped justice for decades. They retreated to the Thai border and, incredibly, continued to receive support from China and even tacit backing from the United States and its allies. Why? Because the world was still locked in Cold War politics. Vietnam was allied with the Soviet Union, so the West supported anyone who opposed Vietnam, even genocidal maniacs. The Khmer Rouge even retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations until 1993. The victims of genocide watched as their tormentors received international recognition and support. It was a betrayal that added insult to unimaginable injury. Pol Pot lived in relative comfort in the jungle until 1998, when he died of heart failure, never having faced justice for his crimes. He was never tried in an international court. He never spent a day in prison. He died while under house arrest by his own former comrades, who feared he had become a liability. Other top Khmer Rouge leaders also escaped prosecution for years. It wasn't until 2006 that a special tribunal was finally established to try surviving Khmer Rouge leaders. Even then, the trials were slow and limited. Only a handful of the regime's leaders have been convicted. For many survivors, justice has been inadequate and far too late. The legacy of the Khmer Rouge continues to haunt Cambodia today. The country lost an entire generation of skilled professionals, leaving a gap in knowledge and expertise that persists decades later. The trauma has passed down through generations, with many survivors suffering from PTSD and other psychological wounds. Landmines planted during the Khmer Rouge era and subsequent conflicts continue to kill and maim Cambodians. The economic development of Cambodia was set back decades. The social trust necessary for a functioning society was destroyed. Even now, Cambodians struggle with the question of how to remember this period, how to teach it to young people, how to reconcile with neighbors who may have been perpetrators. So what lessons can we learn from this unimaginable tragedy? First, utopian ideologies taken to their extreme are inherently dangerous. The Khmer Rouge believed they could create a perfect society by eliminating everything they deemed corrupt. In their pursuit of purity, they created hell on earth. Second, dehumanization is the first step toward genocide. The Khmer Rouge taught people to see certain groups as less than human, as enemies or parasites. Once that mental barrier is crossed, atrocity becomes possible. Third, the international community cannot turn a blind eye to atrocities for political convenience. The world's failure to intervene in Cambodia and its subsequent support of the Khmer Rouge for geopolitical reasons is a stain on the conscience of nations. Fourth, education and remembrance are crucial. The Khmer Rouge targeted intellectuals because educated people can question authority, can see through propaganda, can resist ideological manipulation. An educated population is a defense against tyranny. And finally, we must remember that ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when placed in certain conditions. The executioners of the Khmer Rouge weren't monsters from birth. They were human beings who were indoctrinated, who were placed in a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, who were given permission by ideology to commit murder. Understanding this doesn't excuse their actions, but it should make us vigilant about the systems and ideologies we allow to take root in our own societies. Cambodia today is slowly rebuilding. Its population is young, with the majority born after the Khmer Rouge era. There's a vibrancy to Phnom Penh now, with bustling markets, growing businesses, and cautious optimism about the future. But the scars remain. The killing fields have been turned into memorials where visitors can pay respects to the dead. Survivors share their stories with younger generations, ensuring that the memory of what happened isn't lost. The Cambodian people have shown remarkable resilience in rebuilding their lives and their nation from the ashes of genocide. The story of the Khmer Rouge is a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and remarkable resilience. It shows us what happens when ideology overrides basic human decency, when a nation turns against itself, when the pursuit of a perfect society becomes the vehicle for mass murder. It's a history we must never forget, not just to honor the millions who died, but to ensure that such horrors never happen again. In a world where authoritarianism is rising, where propaganda spreads faster than ever, where dehumanizing rhetoric targets vulnerable groups, the lessons of Cambodia are more relevant than ever. If this deep dive into one of history's darkest chapters has left you with questions, thoughts, or reflections, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. History isn't just about remembering what happened. It's about understanding why it happened so we can build a better future. If you found this exploration valuable and want to see more content that examines the complex battles that have shaped our world, consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you think others should hear this story, share this video. These are the stories that need to be told, the lessons that need to be learned. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop questioning the narratives that shape our world.